all Israel, equals corporate Israel. One issue regarding the Old Testament that erudite scholars have long debated is the significance of the appellation, all Israel. What does it mean? Why did the prophets use it to refer to the northern kingdom after the division of the kingdom, following the death of Solomon? Why do some translations infer the Apostle Paul uses it when he says this? Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 13, HSSB. But it is not possible that the word of the living God has run aground, for these individuals, everyone who is from the man Israel, are not Israel, nor that Abraham's seed are all his children, but a seed will be summoned for you through Isaac. That is, these children of the flesh are not children of the living God, but only the children of the promise are reckoned as his seed. For this is the word of a promise, at this time I will come back, and Sarah will have a son. Now not only Sarah, but also Rebekah, who got pregnant by one man, our father Isaac. For not yet having been engendered or involved in anything good or bad, so that the plan of the living God with respect to his choice would remain, not on the basis of works but only on the basis of the one who was going to invite him, she was told that the more important will be a slave to the less important. Just as it has been written, I loved Jacob, but I hated Esau. If you have read Not All Israel is Israel, you should already know what Paul means by what he says in that passage. He knows the promise was handed down from one heir of the promise to the next, until it came into the possession of Jacob. He also knows, all Israel, is how the prophets referred to corporate Israel, that is, to the sons of Israel as if they were one person. But a little later on in the book of Romans, Paul makes it clear that he also knows the significance of the phrase, all Israel, but what he knows in that regard does not jive at all with the lie that one finds when they search the phrase on the internet. Let me show you what Paul says. Romans chapter 11, verses 1 through 32, HSSB. Therefore I say, has the living God not repudiated his people? Certainly not. For I am also an Israelite, one of Abraham's seed, of Benjamin's tribe. The living God has not repudiated his people, whom he knew before. Or are you not aware of what the scripture says about Elijah when he was filing a petition with the living God against Israel? Your Majesty, they killed your prophets, they demolished your sacrificial altars, and I have been left alone as a small remnant, and they are seeking my soul. But what does the divine communication say to him? I have left behind for myself 7,000 men who have not bent a knee to Baal. So also, therefore, at the present time there has also come to be a remnant in accordance with their choice of a favor. But if salvation is by a favor, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise the favor would no longer be a favor. What therefore? Israel has not gained possession of this thing that it is diligently seeking. The one who is his choice has now gained possession of it, but the rest of the members of Israel have been turned to stone, just as it has been written, the living God gave them a spirit of deep sleep, eyes that cannot see, and ears that cannot hear, up to the day today. And David says, let their table be turned into a snare and into a trap, even into a deadfall trap and into payback to them. Let their eyes be darkened, so that they cannot see, and bend their back down at all times. Therefore I say, did they not trip so that they fell? Certainly not. But the salvation for the Gentiles is in their transgression, so that he could make them jealous. But if their transgression is the world's wealth, and their failure, the Gentiles' wealth, how much more will their fullness be? But I am speaking to you, the Gentiles. Therefore, for as long as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I do, in fact, glorify my service, if somehow I could make my flesh jealous and save some of them. For if his scrapping of them is the world's reconciliation, what is their admission if not life from those who are dead? But if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also, and if the root is holy, the branches are also. But if some of the branches were broken off, and then you, who are a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them and became a fellow partaker of the sap of the root of the olive tree, do not speak derisively about the branches. But if you are speaking derisively about them, you are not carrying the root, but the root is carrying you. Therefore, you will say, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Well said. They were broken off because of their lack of belief in God's promise, but you stand because of your belief in God's promise. You must not have your mind set on thoughts that are impressive, but be afraid. For if the living God did not spare the branches that are in accordance with nature, neither will he spare you. Therefore, take a look at God's benevolence and harshness. On the one hand, harshness for those who fell, but on the other hand, God's benevolence for you, if you stay there in his benevolence, since you could also be cut off. But even those individuals, if they do not stay there in their lack of belief in God's promise, will be grafted in, for the living God is able to graft them in again. For if you, those who are, in accordance with nature, part of the wild olive tree, were cut off and contrary to nature, grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these individuals, who are in accordance with nature, be grafted into their own olive tree? For I do not want you, brothers, to not understand this mystery so that you are not sensible in yourselves. Because a hardening of a part in Israel has occurred until the time when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Then, just as it has been written, all Israel will be saved in this way. The one who delivers will come from Zion. He will turn those who are depraved away from Jacob. And this is the testament from me for them, when I take away their sins. On the one hand, they are enemies with respect to the good news of the fulfillment of the promise because of you, but on the other hand, they are beloved because of their fathers, in accordance with his choice, for the gifts and the invitation of the living God are unchanging. For indeed, just as you were at one time not persuaded by God's promise about the living God, but you have now been shown mercy because of the apathy of these individuals, so also now, these individuals were not persuaded by God's promise about your mercy, so that they could also now be shown mercy. For the living God has confined every last one in apathy, so that he could have mercy on every last one. I am going to explain an essential part of this mystery that Paul mentions in verse 25 of that passage so that those who have insight, Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, are all on the same page going forward. Unfortunately, anyone with eyes that cannot see, and ears that cannot hear, won't have a clue as to what I have explained when I am finished, just because it will appear to be completely nonsensical to them. In many, if not most cases, they will vehemently disagree with what I say here. That is because the truth regarding their situation is exactly as Paul describes it in this passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 2 through 6, HSSB. But we who are not walking in dishonesty nor counterfeiting the word of the living God, but commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of the living God, by our disclosure of the truth, have renounced their shameful secrets. So even if the good news of the fulfillment of the promise we have is covered, it is covered in those who are being done away with, those in whom the God of this current age has blinded the thoughts of those who do not believe God's promise, so that they cannot distinctly see the illumination of the good news of the fulfillment of the promise, of the glory of the Anointed One, who is the image of the living God. For we do not preach ourselves but only His Majesty, Jesus the Anointed One, and then ourselves as your slaves for Jesus. Because the living God, who said, "A light will shine out of darkness," is the one who has shone in our hearts with an illumination of the knowledge of the truth, regarding the glory of the living God on the face of Jesus the Anointed One. Now that I have bluntly told you how I assess those who disagree with the teaching God called me to teach, I am going to give you a paraphrase of what Paul says in the passage above, but I am going to include a bit of his mindset right along with how he expresses it. Based on what I explained in the previous chapter, you should already know that the living God has not completely abandoned His people. Just as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all individually heirs of the promise, so also at this time there is one individual who is heir of the promise. Jesus Christ became the heir of the promise when He became corporate Israel, the firstborn Son of God who has been the heir of the promise since the ratification of the Mosaic covenant. Just as the majority of the members of corporate Israel in the time of Elijah were cut off from corporate Israel, so also the individual members of corporate Israel were cut off from that corporate body in our day. But there are many of us who were members of corporate Israel who are still members of corporate Israel. We are members of that corporate body because, after we were cut off from it, we were grafted back into it in the same way that you were grafted in. But we were given the opportunity to be grafted in before you Gentiles, because we were members of the corporate body before we were cut off from it. So don't lord it over the Jews who have rejected Christ, because you can easily be cut off from Christ, corporate Israel, in the same way that they were, and they can be grafted back in. Now that I have warned you not to think too highly of yourself as members of corporate Israel, let me explain the mystery of how God intends to salvage the remaining members of corporate Israel. He is going to continue to allow Gentiles to be grafted into corporate Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And the individual members of corporate Israel who are grafted in, will be grafted in the same way that we have been, by being forgiven freely under the terms of the oral will, that Jesus made before He died. After Gentiles have been grafted into corporate Israel, the totality of that corporate body will be saved.